The E.N.D. Margaret Jones, the chief flight attendant, rushed down the aisle when she heard the commotion. She was an experienced woman with silver-streaked hair and 20 years of service with the airline. She quickly took in the scene, scattered papers across the floor, Richard standing red-faced, and a calm woman sitting with perfect posture despite the humiliation. "What's happening here?" Margaret asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "This passenger refuses to move from the upgraded section," Richard explained quickly. "And now she's made a mess." Emma looked directly at Margaret. "He slapped my presentation materials out of my hands. I have not refused anything except to move without verification of a seating change." Margaret looked more closely at Emma, and the color slowly drained from her face. Recognition dawned in her eyes. "Miss Thompson?" she asked quietly. Emma nodded slightly. Margaret turned to Richard, her expression serious. "Richard, may I speak with you in the galley?" "Now." Richard frowned, confused by the sudden change in tone. He followed Margaret to the front of the plane, out of earshot from the passengers. "Do you know who that is?" Margaret whispered urgently. "Some woman making trouble," Richard replied. "That is Emma Thompson." Richard shrugged. "Should I know her?" "She owns Horizon Airways," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's our boss. The CEO and founder of this entire airline." The color drained from Richard's face as the truth hit him. He felt suddenly dizzy, gripping the wall for support. "That's impossible," he stammered. "She's sitting in economy. She's wearing jeans. She always flies economy on her own airline. She doesn't believe in wasting company resources," Margaret explained. "She started as a flight attendant herself years ago before creating her education technology company. When it succeeded, she bought this struggling airline and turned it around." Richard felt sick. "I slapped her papers out of her hands. I threatened to have her removed." "Yes," Margaret confirmed grimly. "You did." Back in the cabin, 2 other flight attendants were helping Emma gather her scattered materials. Passengers watched in awkward silence, some recording the incident on their phones. "I'm so sorry about this, ma'am," a young flight attendant named Olivia said as she handed Emma a stack of recovered papers. "Thank you," Emma replied kindly. She looked at Olivia's name tag. "Olivia, I appreciate your help." Margaret returned to Emma's seat, her face etched with concern and embarrassment. Behind her, Richard looked as though he might faint. "Miss Thompson, I cannot apologize enough for this incident," Margaret said formally. "Of course you are in the correct seat," and Richard was completely mistaken about any upgrade changes. The watching passengers began to whisper among themselves, trying to figure out what was happening. "She owns the airline," someone murmured, and the information spread quickly through the cabin. Richard stood frozen, unable to meet Emma's eyes. His career flashed before him, 6 years of service, now surely ended by one moment of terrible judgment. He had treated a passenger, his own CEO, with shocking disrespect. Emma took a deep breath. She had built her company on principles of dignity and respect. Her own experiences of discrimination had shaped her business values. How she handled this moment would reflect those values more than any company policy she had written. "Richard," she said calmly, "would you please join me for a conversation?" Richard stepped forward, trembling slightly. "Miss Thompson, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Emma raised her hand to stop him. "Whether or not you knew who I was should not determine how you treat anyone on this aircraft." Nearby passengers nodded in agreement. An older gentleman across the aisle gave Emma a thumbs up. "Would all passengers please take their seats and fasten seatbelts?" The captain's voice came over the intercom. "We're ready for departure." Margaret looked nervously between Emma and Richard. "Miss Thompson, what would you like us to do?" The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the airline's owner would do to the flight attendant who had disrespected her so publicly. Emma looked at Richard thoughtfully. The easy choice would be to have him removed from the flight and fired immediately. But Emma had built her success on seeing the potential in difficult situations. Richard will continue his duties on this flight, she said firmly. And afterward, we'll have a proper conversation about what happened here today. Richard's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected immediate termination. "Thank you, Miss Thompson," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't deserve a second chance." "Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn and grow," Emma replied. "Now, let's have a safe flight to London." The flight reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding. Most passengers had settled in, though many still whispered about the incident. Some took quick glances at Emma, now recognizing her as the airline's owner despite her casual dress. Richard moved through the cabin with extreme care, his face still pale. He offered drinks and snacks to passengers with perfect politeness, though his hands shook slightly. When he reached Emma's row, he hesitated. "Would you like anything to drink, Miss Thompson?" he asked quietly. "Just water, please," Emma replied. When Richard returned with her water, he placed it gently on her tray table. "Miss Thompson, may I speak with you when I finish service?" Emma nodded. "Meet me in the rear galley in 20 minutes. Richard continued his duties, feeling the weight of his mistake with every step. He had always prided himself on being a professional. Now his career hung by a thread because of one terrible moment of judgment. Meanwhile, Emma organized her presentation materials. The education software she had created helped children in poor neighborhoods learn math and reading. It adjusted to each child's learning style and gave them personalized help. Started in her small apartment 5 years ago, her company now helps thousands of children. The investors in London could help her reach millions more. 20 minutes later, Emma made her way to the rear galley. Richard stood waiting, looking nervous. "I was a flight attendant for 7 years, Emma began without preamble. "I know how stressful this job can be." Richard looked surprised. "You were?" Emma nodded. "That's how I paid my bills while developing my software. I've had passengers yell at me, spill drinks on me, and refuse to listen to safety instructions. I've worked double shifts when coworkers called in sick. I'd missed family events to cover holiday flights." Richard swallowed hard. "It's a demanding job, but that's no excuse for how I behaved." "No, it's not," Emma agreed. "Tell me what happened today." "The truth." Richard took a deep breath. "I was having a terrible morning. My girlfriend and I had a fight. I spilled coffee on my uniform. I was running late." He paused. "But that's not the whole truth." Emma waited silently. "When I saw you," he continued with difficulty, "I made assumptions. Your simple clothes, your worn briefcase, and yes, I think because you're a black woman, I decided you didn't belong in that seat. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I think that's what happened." Emma appreciated his honesty. Awareness is the first step toward change. "Are you going to fire me?" Richard asked directly. "What do you think should happen?" Emma countered. Richard thought for a moment. "If I were in your position, I probably would fire me. But if you're asking what I hope for..." He looked at her directly. "I hope for a chance to learn from this and become better." Emma studied him carefully. 10 years ago, before I started my company, I was flying to a technology conference. I had saved for months to buy that ticket. The flight attendant assumed I was in the wrong seat and embarrassed me in front of everyone. Despite showing my boarding pass, I was moved to the back of the plane. Richard winced. "When I bought this airline years later," Emma continued, "my first priority was creating a culture of respect for all passengers, regardless of how they look or what they wear." She pulled out her company tablet and opened a file. "This is our employee handbook. Section 12 clearly states that any employee who discriminates against passengers faces immediate termination." Richard's shoulders slumped. "However," Emma continued, "Section 13 says that I believe in second chances and growth opportunities." Richard looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "I've created a customer respect training program based on my own experiences," Emma explained. "It helps staff recognize their biases and learn better ways to handle difficult situations. I would take that program very seriously, Richard said earnestly.
Emma considered him for a long moment.
Here's what I propose: you'll complete the training program. You'll work with our HR team to develop additional training materials based on what happened today. And for the next 6 months, you'll be on probation.
Richard nodded eagerly.
Thank you, Miss Thompson.
I promise I won't let you down.
This isn't just about me, Emma replied.
It's about ensuring every person who flies with us is treated with dignity.
As they finished their conversation, turbulence shook the plane.
Richard automatically reached to steady Emma.
Sorry, he said, quickly removing his hand.
Emma smiled slightly. You're still a flight attendant, Richard. Safety first.
As Emma returned to her seat, she thought about the choice she had made. Some would say Richard deserved to be fired. Perhaps he did. But Emma believed that transformation was possible when people were given the chance to learn from their mistakes.
The plane began its descent into London Heathrow. Emma closed her laptop after reviewing her presentation one final time.
Outside the window, the English countryside appeared through breaks in the clouds, green and peaceful below. Richard moved through the cabin, helping passengers prepare for landing. He worked with a new carefulness, treating each person with equal respect and attention. When he passed Emma's row, he gave her a small, respectful nod. After landing, Emma waited as other passengers gathered their belongings and filed off the plane. She watched Richard assisting an elderly man with his overhead bag, patiently helping him into a wheelchair that waited at the gate.
As Emma finally stood to leave, Margaret approached her.
Miss Thompson, thank you for how you handled the situation with Richard, she said quietly.
Many executives would have responded differently.
Emma smiled. We all have choices in how we react to difficult moments. Those choices define us more than the moments themselves.
Will you be on our return flight next week? Margaret asked.
Yes, I'm scheduled for Friday's evening flight. I'll make sure everything goes smoothly, Margaret promised.
Emma stepped off the plane into the busy terminal.
Her London meetings would begin tomorrow morning. Tonight, she would review her notes in her modest hotel room, not the luxury accommodation the investors had offered to arrange.
Emma had always been careful with money, remembering the years when she had none. The next morning, Emma arrived at the investment firm's gleaming office building.
She wore a simple but professional navy blue dress, her hair neatly braided. The receptionist looked her up and down with slight confusion.
I'm here for the 9 o'clock meeting with Mr.
Harrington, Emma said. And you are? The receptionist asked with a raised eyebrow.
Emma Thompson, CEO of EdTech Solutions.
Emma Thompson hurried through the airport terminal, her heart racing. She was late for her flight to London where she would pitch her education technology company to potential investors. After years of developing software to help underprivileged children access quality education, this meeting could change everything. Emma clutched her worn leather briefcase tightly as she approached the gate, praying they hadn't closed boarding. Final call for Flight 247 to London Heathrow, the announcement echoed through the terminal. Emma rushed forward, breathless, presenting her boarding pass to the gate agent who nodded her through with a smile. On the aircraft, she found her seat in economy class and settled in, mentally rehearsing her presentation. Though her company had grown impressively over 5 years, Emma still traveled modestly, saving every penny to reinvest in her mission. The plane was nearly full. Emma placed her small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment and sat down. She looked around at her fellow passengers. Business people in suits tapped on laptops. Families with children settled in for the long flight. Emma took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. This trip meant everything to her company's future. Her journey had not been easy. As a black woman in the tech industry, she had faced countless closed doors and doubtful looks. But Emma had persevered. Her education software now helped thousands of children in underserved communities. This meeting in London could help her reach millions more. A flight attendant named Richard moved through the cabin, checking that everyone had fastened their seatbelts. He was tall with neatly combed hair and a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes.
He looked tired and annoyed as he made his way down the aisle.
When Richard reached Emma's row, he stopped suddenly. He looked at her, then at his tablet, then back at her again with narrowed eyes.
"Excuse me," he said curtly, "may I see your boarding pass again?"
Emma handed it over politely, noticing his dismissive glance at her simple clothing. She wore comfortable jeans and a plain black sweater for the long flight, not the designer clothes many business travelers chose. "There seems to be some mistake," Richard said loudly, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "This seat is reserved for our premium customers." "There's no mistake," Emma replied calmly.
"I'm in the correct seat, 24B. Other passengers began to stare. An older woman across the aisle watched with concern.
A man in a business suit 2 rows ahead turned around to look.
Richard's face reddened as he gestured impatiently.
This entire section was just upgraded for premier members only.
"You'll need to move to the back of the plane. I checked in online yesterday," Emma explained patiently. "This is my assigned seat. Please check your system again." Richard's jaw tightened. He was having a terrible day.
His morning had started with a fight with his girlfriend, followed by a spilled coffee on his uniform, and now this difficult passenger who wouldn't cooperate. "Please gather your things and follow me," he said, his voice rising.
"We need to finish boarding." Emma opened her briefcase and pulled out a printed copy of her confirmation. "See? Seat 24B, as assigned." Richard barely glanced at the paper. "That's an old confirmation.
The seating has been reorganized. Now please move so we can take off on time."
Emma looked around at the watching passengers, feeling the familiar sting of being singled out.
She had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never hurt less. Still, she remained composed. "I would be happy to move if there's been a change, but I'll need you to show me where in your system it says my seat assignment has changed," she said reasonably. Richard was not used to being questioned.
Most passengers simply did as they were told. His patience snapped.
"Look," he hissed, leaning closer.
"Either you move now, or I'll have security remove you from this flight." The threat hung in the air.
The cabin had grown eerily quiet as nearby passengers pretended not to listen. "Please get the chief flight attendant," Emma requested firmly. "I'm not moving without proper verification of this supposed change." Richard's face flushed with anger. In a terrible lapse of judgment, he reached down and slapped Emma's papers from her hands, sending her presentation materials scattering across the floor. "Now look what you've made me do," he exclaimed.
A shocked silence fell over the nearby passengers.
Emma stared at her scattered papers, then at Richard, her expression a mix of disbelief and dignity. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor immediately," she said quietly.
The receptionist checked her list. "Oh yes. Please take a seat. Mr. Harrington will be with you shortly." Emma sat in the waiting area, used to this reaction. After 15 minutes, a young assistant appeared. "Miss Thompson? Mr. Harrington is ready for you now."
She was led into a large conference room where 5 men in expensive suits sat around a polished table.
William Harrington, a silver-haired man in his 60s, stood to greet her.
"Miss Thompson, welcome," he said, looking slightly surprised at her appearance.
"We were expecting someone different?" Emma finished with a small smile. "I get that a lot."
There was an awkward pause before everyone took their seats. Emma opened her worn leather briefcase and removed her presentation materials. "Gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity," she began confidently.
"Today I'll show you how EdTech Solutions is changing education for underserved communities around the world."
As Emma began her presentation, she could feel the initial skepticism in the room. But as she shared impressive data about student improvement rates and showed videos of children using her software in schools from poor neighborhoods in America to remote villages in developing countries, the atmosphere slowly changed. "Our software adapts to each child's learning style," Emma explained, demonstrating the program on her tablet.
"It provides personalized education to students who might otherwise fall through the cracks."
By the end of her presentation, the investors were leaning forward with interest. "Miss Thompson," said Mr. Harrington, "your results are remarkable.
And you also own Horizon Airways? Emma nodded.
Yes, I purchased the struggling airline 3 years ago. We've since doubled our routes and improved customer satisfaction by 87%.
Impressive, another investor commented. But why continue with the education software when the airline is clearly more profitable? Emma smiled. Because profit isn't my only measure of success.
The software helps children who remind me of myself as a child. I grew up in a poor neighborhood with few opportunities. A teacher who believed in me changed my life.
Now I want to be that change for others. The room fell silent as the investors exchanged glances.
We came prepared to offer partial funding, Mr. Harrington said finally.
But after your presentation, we'd like to discuss full funding for global expansion.
Emma's heart leaped, but she maintained her composed expression.
I'm listening.
As they discussed terms, Emma thought about her journey. From the little girl who loved computers but couldn't afford one, to the flight attendant saving every penny, to the software developer working nights after long flights, to the entrepreneur sitting in this room negotiating millions in funding. She also thought about Richard and their conversation on the plane.
People made mistakes.
People misjudged others based on appearance.
But people could also learn and grow when given the chance.
Miss Thompson, Mr. Harrington said, extending his hand across the table, I believe we have a deal.
Emma smiled and shook his hand firmly. I believe we do.
The END 1 week later, Emma waited at the gate for her flight home.
The London meetings had been a complete success.
The investors had committed to funding her education software's expansion into 50 countries over the next 3 years.
Millions more children would now have access to quality education.
Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she thought about all those young lives that would change for the better.
Flight 382 to New York is now boarding, announced the gate agent.
Emma joined the line, her mind already racing with plans. She would need to hire more staff, establish new offices, train local teachers on using the software. The work ahead was enormous, but exciting. When she reached the front of the line, the gate agent smiled warmly.
Ms. Thompson, welcome aboard. We've been expecting you. Emma handed over her boarding pass, surprised at being recognized.
As she walked down the jetway to the plane, she wondered if Margaret had alerted the staff about her return journey.
At the aircraft door, a familiar face greeted her.
It was Richard.
Good evening, Miss Thompson, he said with a respectful nod. Welcome aboard. Emma smiled. Good evening, Richard. I didn't expect to see you on this flight.
I requested this route specifically, he explained.
I hoped you would be on board. Emma followed him onto the plane.
To her surprise, many of the crew members smiled and nodded at her with recognition. Word had clearly spread about the airline's owner and her encounter with Richard. Your seat is right this way, Richard said, leading her not to her usual economy seat, but toward first class.
There must be a mistake, Emma said, stopping in the aisle. I always book economy.
No mistake, Richard assured her.
The crew pooled our flight benefits to upgrade you. A small thank you for your kindness last week. Please accept it. Emma was touched by the gesture.
She rarely flew first class, even though she could easily afford it. She preferred to invest the money back into her companies. That's very thoughtful, she said, taking the offered seat. Once all passengers were aboard and the plane was in the air, Richard came to check on her.
How did your meetings go? He asked.
Very well, Emma replied.
Full funding for global expansion. Congratulations, Richard said sincerely. And I have some news to share as well, if you have a moment. Emma nodded, and Richard continued.
After our conversation, I completed the customer respect training program in record time, he began.
Then I approached HR with an idea.
I've started working with them to create a new training module based on my experience.
That's wonderful, Emma said. We're calling it checking your assumptions, Richard explained.
It helps staff recognize when they're making judgments based on appearance, accent, or other factors rather than facts.
Emma could see the genuine enthusiasm in his face.
The first session was last week, Richard continued. I shared my story, how I misjudged the owner of the company and what I learned from it. 20 flight attendants attended, and they've already requested more sessions. How did it feel to share your experience?
Emma asked.
Richard thought for a moment.
Humbling, but also empowering.
By owning my mistake, I can help others avoid making the same one. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Richard excused himself to check on other passengers. As Emma watched him move through the cabin, treating each person with the same respectful attention, she felt a deep satisfaction. This was the culture she had wanted to create, one where mistakes became opportunities for growth rather than ending points. Near the end of the flight, Margaret came to sit in the empty seat beside Emma.
Richard has become our best trainer, she said. His session has a waiting list now.
Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best contributions, Emma replied.
Margaret nodded. We've also implemented your suggestion about reviewing our hiring practices. We're actively recruiting more diverse candidates for all positions.
As the plane began its descent, Emma looked out the window at the approaching coastline of home. She thought about the path that had brought her here, from a child with limited opportunities to a successful entrepreneur whose companies were changing lives.
The flight attendant who had slapped her papers away was now teaching others about respect and dignity.
The software she had created in her tiny apartment would soon help children around the world. The airline she had purchased was becoming a model for inclusive business practices. Before leaving the plane, Emma stopped to speak with Richard one last time.
Thank you, she said simply. For what? Richard asked. I'm the one who should be thanking you. Emma smiled.
For reminding me why I started these companies in the first place. Not just to make money, but to create places where people can grow, learn, and become their best selves.
Richard nodded, understanding. Have a good evening, Miss Thompson. Emma, she corrected him. My friends call me Emma. The end.